In this, the third episode in the evidence of guilt against the leading Jack the Ripper suspect, Charles Lechmere, I will examine some of the perhaps ephemeral issues which are nevertheless pointers to his guilt. I'll dig into his background to find other red flags. Please excuse me, I've got a slight gravelly voice, got a slight winter cold coming on, and the cold atmosphere is closing in. Anyway, the first two episodes of this mini-series focused on the recorded activities of Charles Lechmere, who during that time passed himself off as Charles Cross, during the first few days after the murder of Mary Ann or Polly Nichols, the first of the so-called canonical victims of the serial killer known to history as Jack the Ripper. In part two, I referred to Charles Lechmere walking off with Robert Paul down Hanbury Street after his controversial conversation with PC Jonas Misen on the morning of the 31st of August 1888. A few minutes later, they passed a location where Annie Chapman was murdered on the morning of Saturday, the 8th of September, just 8 days later. Annie Chapman was murdered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, a little over 100 yards from where Robert Paul and Charles Lechmere parted, with Robert Paul, who worked in Cobbett's Court, going off down Cobbett's Court, now called Cobbett's Place. They didn't know each other, by the way. With a slip of the tongue, I think I actually said 28 Hanbury Street in the last episode, but I don't think anyone noticed. The gap between the murders of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman was the shortest between any of the Whitechapel murders, with the obvious exception of the double event where two people killed on the same day. This tells us something. Was the killer motivated by an urge to kill again so soon? Was it purely that he frequently went looking for a victim, but only struck when he felt comfortable because of the circumstances, the location, the number of passers-by, or some other factor, and he was often looking for a victim but didn't find one, and it was just that happenstance that it was 8 days later? Or was there another reason why he wanted to strike so quickly and in that general location? There are, by the way, conflicting times of death for the proposed for the murder of Annie Chapman. The body was found at about 6 a.m. and Dr. Bagster Phillips examined her at about 6:30 a.m, 30 minutes later. He thought that she had been dead for more than 2 hours, putting his estimated time of death as sometime before about 4:30. He had a number of factors with which to help him make this determination. There was the body temperature. Doctors were experienced at using touch to estimate temperature, and particularly the difference in temperature between the external surfaces of the body and internal organs. There was also the onset of rigor mortis, the digestion of food contents in her stomach, and the clotting of blood. All of these are variables, and clearly the doctor was aware of external factors that can affect this, as he gave reference to the coldness of the morning in question, for example. Bagster Phillips was an experienced doctor, and his estimate must carry weight. Incidentally, he believed the victim had been strangled prior to the knife wounds being perpetrated on the body. I highlight this as many people query in the comments underneath these videos the amount of blood that would have potentially transferred to the killer. Strangulation limits arterial flow, although there was some evidence in the case of the case of Annie Chapman of some arterial spray on the fence. A small amount of arterial spray was on the fence next to where her body was found. There was another potential time of death, and that was estimated with reference to 3 witnesses. A man called John Richardson called at the premises to check that a back access hatch to the cellar was locked, as there'd been break-ins in the property, and this was about 4:45, and he testified under oath that there was no body in the yard. He claims to have sat on the back step that led to the yard, very close to where the body was found, although it was dark at that time of the morning. So at 4:45, 15 minutes after the very earliest estimate of the doctor, he said there was no one there. Secondly, a woman called Elizabeth Long said that she later identified as being Annie Chapman when she saw the dead body. She saw her talking to a man outside number 29 at about 5:30 a.m, that's half an hour before the body was found, and she said she'd heard a brewery clock chiming shortly before she saw this woman. That's how she said it was 5:30. Lastly, a neighbour called Albert Kadosh went to use his outside toilet just after 5:30 and said he heard a voice and then a brush on the adjoining fence, which taken to represent Annie Chapman's attacker saying something and then killing her with her body knocking on the fence as he did so. If these three witnesses are correct, then Baxter Phillips was way out with his estimate, as he would have been, don't forget, he would have been examining a freshly slain corpse just half an hour or so after it had been killed. His estimate must have been way off the mark if he couldn't tell the difference between a body that had been so freshly slain. This controversy over the time of death is a big debating point in the Ripper world. Annie Chapman had last been seen at about 1:35 a.m. at her lodging house, which was quite close to where she was killed. If she was killed at 5:30, why hadn't she been seen in that roughly 4-hour gap? Also, it was light by 5:30, and there were dozens of windows that faced onto the backyard of number 29. The killer would have been taking a huge risk to have killed her then, particularly after having supposedly been seen by Mrs. Long just before. The time proposed by Baxter Phillips makes more sense. Although modern doctors are more cautious about subscribing times of death than doctors in the era of Baxter Phillips did have several indicators with which to inform his estimate, and they all pointed in the same direction. The police, who had the advantage of being able to assess the reliability of those three witnesses, tended to think the doctor's estimate was correct. This was shown in Chief Inspector Swanson's report in October 1888, where he tended to side with the doctor. In historical analysis, it isn't always necessary to have a hard and fast opinion when the outcome is unclear. In a field like Ripperology, which, let's face it, isn't proper history, and where you meet lots of extreme opinions, and incidentally, if you look at some of the comments that are generated, I don't like deleting comments on the videos, but some recently I've had to, because you get some really extreme and slightly nutty madness and abuse generated by people. You get highly dogmatic opinions over what supposedly was the time of death for Annie Chapman, with the earlier version, the doctor's version, or the three witnesses version. Those who favour the later time, the time supported by the witnesses, tend to get very angry, frankly, when they're challenged and gone about how modern doctors would say about an estimated time of death. The earlier time of death, that's supported by Baxter Phillips and supported by looking at the Ripper's modus operandi and favoured by the police at the time, is close to the time that Polly Nichols was killed. And this murder was on Lechmere's route to work as he walked it on the morning of the 31st of August. However, I would suggest that he probably met Annie Chapman on Commercial Street rather than on Hanbury Street. That, I believe, would have been a much more likely location for her to have been soliciting, and she would have taken her client, who was her murderer, back to the yard on Hanbury Street, which was a known location that prostitutes took their clients to. However, I have a theory that Lechmere purposefully chose that general location and committed the crime soon after the Bucks Row murder with deliberation. Sure, the main motivation would have most likely been to satisfy his psychopathic urges with the other murders, but he knew that Robert Paul worked close by at Cobbett's Court, and Paul's newspaper interview would have been the reason that forced Lechmere to take the risk in coming forward and appearing at the inquest. And I covered this in the previous series of this mini-series, whereas Paul himself hadn't even come forward to the police at that stage anyway. So I think Lechmere almost went out of his way to commit this particular crime, and this means that he could easily have committed the crime later also. Lechmere was, of course, a carman, a cart delivery driver, and they frequently had to park their carts, or they called them vans at the time, vans, up outside premises where they had to deliver. And sometimes they were left hanging around for literally hours waiting for their cart or their van to be unloaded. And they sometimes took a boy on the back of the van to look after it, to act as a cart minder. Elizabeth Long, the witness who I mentioned before, one of her jobs, or her job in fact, was to act as a cart minder, looking after the carts were unloading fruit and veg at Spitalfields Market, which was very close to the murder scene at Hanbury Street. If Lechmere had such a delivery anywhere within, say, 20 minutes walk of Hanbury Street, and that covered a very huge area of central London, he could have slipped away, saying he was going to a cafe. And when you read accounts of carmen at that time, and usually to do with court cases where they were involved in pilfering actually, van drivers frequently went off to cafes when they were waiting around, and they had a lot of waiting around time. And Lechmere could easily have committed this crime at a later time, saying he was going off to a cafe while his cart was being unloaded. Perhaps that's why I can be relaxed about the timings of the Annie Chapman murder. We know, incidentally, that the police did engage in an extensive search for Robert Paul, and he eventually appeared at the Polly Nichols inquest, but quite a while after the murder of Annie Chapman. So there's good reason to think that Lechmere's gratuitous and revengeful strategy of diverting the police to find Paul worked. When you have a suspect in the frame for one murder, and it is thought that it might be part of a series, it's thought that that murder might be part of a bigger series, it's standard police practice to see if the suspect they have for that first murder, see if his movements and known familiar locations, the locations that were very familiar to him, matched any of the other crime scenes. That's, of course, just common sense. When we apply this discipline to Lechmere, we find a startling correlation between the location of most of the Whitechapel murders and the axis of his route, or possible or probable, take your pick which word you want to use, routes to work. Now, it's my belief that the Ripper, whoever you wish him to be, most likely actually found his victims on the main roads. So, for example, Polly Nichols, I think, was probably, in fact, found by the Ripper, her killer, on Whitechapel Road. And also, probably Martha Tabram and Alice Mackenzie on the same road further down, where it was actually called Whitechapel High Street, it turned into Whitechapel High Street. Annie Chapman, as I said, was probably actually found on Commercial Street, as was probably Mary Kelly. Actually, Martha Tabram or Alice Mackenzie could also either have been found on Commercial Street, which is very close by where both those two were killed. It's far more likely, in my opinion, that street prostitutes late at night would have been looking for customers on main roads rather than the very quiet back streets. That again kind of stands to reason. Incidentally, I include Martha Tabram and Alice Mackenzie, which are both murders which are found on the Metropolitan Police's Whitechapel murder file collection, but neither are necessarily always regarded as being Jack the Ripper murders. I think they both almost certainly were, and I discussed them in earlier films on this channel, and I'll put links to those in this description. I would suggest that Lechmere detoured slightly on those days when he was in the mood for killing, off his normal main route, slightly off onto these main roads, either say the Whitechapel Road, Whitechapel High Street axis, Commercial Street axis, to find a victim on the main drag and make his escape afterwards on the near deserted back streets, which were the more direct routes to his work, with which he would have been very familiar and on which he had a perfect excuse to be found. If the victim took him, say solicited someone on Whitechapel Road and they were going to take him south of Whitechapel Road or somewhere that he didn't feel comfortable, then no doubt he would abort his mission and leave the unknowing potential victim safe but none the wiser. It doesn't mean that Lechmere had some sort of hardwired mania to kill on his way to work, as some people, almost as a parody, try and suggest. A man in Lechmere's position in life, if he had sick, uncontrollable urges to kill, of course, would have had limited opportunities in which to carry out that self-appointed mission. He worked long hours and he had a family. On his way home from work in the early evening, the streets would have been far too crowded, too many people about. On his way to work in the early hours would have been his only real opportunity. As he trudged in and out of work for years, seeing street prostitutes on a daily basis, he had ample opportunity to play out his sick fantasies in his mind, to work through the scenarios before the day when he actually put them into reality. And remember, those streets were largely deserted at that hour, the back streets in particular, and Lechmere had them pretty much to himself. In 1888, for most people, there was only one day off, Sunday. Saturday was a normal working day, and that would have been Lechmere's only other window of opportunity to kill. If Lechmere's access to work accounts for most of the murders, what of the double event? The murders of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes in the early hours of the morning of Sunday, the 30th of September 1888, which didn't take place on that axis. The first of these two murders took place on Berners Street, which was very close to where his mother lived on Mary Ann Street, and pretty much on the axis back from Mary Ann Street to where Lechmere lived at Doveton Street. One of Lechmere's daughters was brought up by his mother, so he had a double reason to visit on that Saturday night. It was also very close to where Lechmere had lived up until the June of that year, when he lived in James Street. So there's another potential reason for him to be in that locality, perhaps going for a drink in a local pub with one of his friends or one of his old neighbours from James Street. The killer was thwarted at Berners Street and probably disturbed by Louis Dimschitz, so he didn't have time to carry out the mutilation ritual that we see on the other victims on the dead body of Liz Stride. And that mutilation ritual seems to have been an important part of his killing process. She had her throat cut and no more. Accordingly, most people accept that the Ripper went off looking for another victim, and the place he chose to go looking was one in the area around Aldgate, probably around St Botolph's Church, which was supposedly known as the prostitute church, as they supposedly paraded around the church plying their trade. It was a supposed haunt of that. I'm sceptical personally of a lot of these legends that grow up around the Jack the Ripper story, but it seems that the general area around Aldgate was a place frequented by prostitutes, and that seems to be probably what drew the Ripper away from Berners Street after being thwarted in the murder of Liz Stride to find another victim. Liz Stride's body was found at 1 a.m. At 1 a.m, Catherine Eddowes was released from Bishopsgate Police Station in the city. She'd been arrested earlier that day in Aldgate, and she was seemingly making her way back there after she was released. Catherine Eddowes' body was found at 1:45, just 45 minutes later, 45 minutes after the body of Liz Stride was found, 45 minutes after Catherine Eddowes was released from Bishopsgate Police Station. Her body was found in Mitre Square. She had been totally cut open, totally ripped apart. The worst case so far. When Lechmere lived at James Street, as I just mentioned, which he lived until the June of that year, his route to work would have taken him past Aldgate on his way to Pickford's at Broad Street. So this route, the route from Berners Street to Mitre Square effectively, or to Aldgate, where he probably found the victim, would have been very familiar to him. A bloodied portion of Catherine Eddowes' apron was cut from her body and left in a doorway on Golston Street under some graffiti that famously read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The route from Mitre Square back to Doveton Street would have taken Lechmere immediately past Golston Street. It is this relentless geography that forms another huge red flag. And these connections are exactly the sort of circumstantial evidence that the police look at when they're investigating potential serious serial killing crimes. For me, one of the biggest red flags to attach to the candidacy of Charles Lechmere as Jack the Ripper is Pinchin Street. You often hear critics say, "Oh, the case against Charles Lechmere is based upon only one murder, that of Polly Nichols." Well, I've just gone through the connection in some detail to the murder of Annie Chapman. What other suspects are actually linked to any single murder? Precious few, if any, frankly. But Lechmere also has his fingerprints all over the Pinchin Street Torso. When I first investigated Lechmere some years ago, it was the Pinchin Street connection that finally convinced me that I was on the right track and actually gave me shivers down my spine. The Pinchin Street Torso is a crossover case, as it's regarded as being one of the Thames Torso murders, but the case is also found among the Whitechapel murder files kept at Scotland Yard. This torso wasn't dumped in the River Thames, although it's regarded as a Thames Torso murder. It was found under a railway arch on Pinchin Street, which is in the East End, just south of Whitechapel, in an area known as St George's in the East. A few hundred yards south, actually, of where the body of Liz Stride was found. One of the reasons we know that Charles Lechmere was the real name of the man who passed himself off as Charles Cross was that in the 1861 census, when he was 11 years old, his stepfather, Thomas Cross, who had bigamously married his mother, entered his name in the census as Charles Cross. That's how we know Charles Cross as Charles Lechmere. The address of the family he was living at the time was 13 Thomas Street in the 1861 census. A few years later, Thomas Street was renamed Pinchin Street. So when he was called Charles Cross for that one time in the 1861 census, he was actually living in Pinchin Street. So Charles Lechmere used to live on Pinchin Street just over 100 yards away from where the body was eventually to be dumped. From around 1876, after his mother had married her second bigamous husband, called Joseph Fosdyke, she again moved back into Pinchin Street, number 23. And from about 1881, at least, the 1881 census onwards, as I said before, one of Charles Lechmere's daughters lived with her mother at 23 Pinchin Street with her bigamous husband until around 1883, when they moved back into Mary Ann Street. It was probably due to there was an extensive building works on Pinchin Street, because they built a new railway viaduct, which led to a number of houses being knocked down, and when all that building work was going on, I think that's roughly when they moved out to Mary Ann Street, and it was this viaduct, the arches of the viaduct, where the Pinchin Street Torso was found in September 1889. Oh, I should tell you also that when actually Lechmere's mother married this second bigamous husband, Joseph Fosdyke, before they moved to 23 Pinchin Street in about 1876, for a few years they lived in a road called Splid Street, initially at number 6, Splid Terrace, and they married in 1872. The first few years, I said, they lived in Splid Terrace, and this bit, Splid Terrace, was demolished also. This bit of road of Splid Terrace was also demolished to make way for this railway viaduct, and the very arch under which the Pinchin Street Torso was found was under the footprint of what had been 6 Splid Terrace. So the torso was literally found on the site of the first house that Lechmere's mother lived in with her second bigamous husband when they first got married. Now that is something, you have to say, of a coincidence. By September 1889, Joseph Fosdyke was on death's door. He had been in and out of the workhouse infirmary, and he died soon afterwards. Lechmere's mother and her infirm husband had moved by then just around the corner onto Cable Street, either 139 or 147. There is a discrepancy in the records. One of the main police theories about the Pinchin Street Torso was that the body had been carried manually to the arch on Pinchin Street, and they actually conducted a house-to-house search on that basis. But the Cable Street address was literally just outside their search zone. To complete the geographic profiling aspect of this case, and to do the Pinchin Street case as well, a bloody rag was found in the foundations of the chapel associated with London Hospital, which was then undergoing building works, a day or so after the Pinchin Street Torso was discovered. This bloody rag, it was found on the direct route back between Pinchin Street and Doveton Street, where Lechmere lived. Now, that's enough for this episode. I've been trying to keep the episodes shorter. Next time, we're going to go into more background on Lechmere's actual family and other connections, perhaps psychological issues which may have influenced his lifetime. And so keep watching. Thank you for watching this episode. Please subscribe and share, and subscribing is free. Thank you very much.